Ontario's Liberal Party chose a new leader on December 2nd, Mississauga Mayor and former Liberal MP Bonnie Crombie. It took 3 ballots at the party's leadership convention for Crombie to claim the throne, defeating rivals Nate Erskine-Smith, Yasser Naqvi, and Ted Chu. Ms. Crombie is facing a tough task ahead of her. She has less than 3 years to rebuild Ontario's third party before going head-to-head with Premier Doug Ford in the next election in 2026. Joining us now to discuss Ms. Crombie's win and the dynamics of that leadership race is Elliot Hughes, Senior Associate at Summa Strategies. Elliot, thank you very much for joining us on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
In your view, what are some of the keys here for Bonnie Crombie's leadership win?
Well, I think it comes down to three things. First is organization. I think Ms. Crombie had a number of very senior Liberals supporting her. They were very well organized. They had a lot of funding because of her fundraising prowess. Second, I think her name recognition. As being a mayor of a very big city in the GTA, I think that drove a lot of interest. And while the other two key contenders were also MPs, I think generally Ms. Crombie was seen as having that better name recognition, excuse me. And then finally, the third piece would be experience. Ms. Crombie, as mayor, has some serious managerial experience, and she's been part of the Liberal Party for over 20 years, starting as a riding president in the early 2000s, working her way up. I think a combination of those factors made her a pretty tough candidate and the right choice.
So one of the keys of a leadership race, or one of the goals of them, in our political system at least, is to revive party membership, build that excitement. But turnout for Liberal members was considerably low. I believe less than 30%. Did a low turnout favor Bonnie Crombie, and why do you think there was such a low turnout?
Well, I'll take the first question there head on here. Look, there always tends to be quite low voter turnout in leadership races. I think when the federal conservatives ran their leadership race, they had a huge number of people sign up, but I don't know if they had a lot of them actually vote. I think they were around the 30 or 40% mark. So again, low. I think that's traditional for leadership races, to be honest. Whether or not the low turnout helped Ms. Crombie is a good question. I think that might play into the fact that she had this good organization. When you have a good organization, you have solid folks in each of the ridings across the province, and making sure that those folks can, the people who support you can come out and you have that ability to really spend that time on that ground game, so to speak. So the low voter turnout may indeed have helped her. I think that in combination with the additional funds and the additional organization probably all together gave her that edge in the leadership race in a low voter turnout environment.
And in terms of the main two competitors, we know that Mr. Naqvi and Mr. Erskine-Smith came to an agreement to support each other in the ranked ballot process in an effort specifically to stop Bonnie Crombie from winning. Why wasn't that move successful?
Yeah, as you say, the two sort of second, third place contenders got together a few weeks before the vote to come out publicly and urge their voters to rank them respectively second in their sort of supporters' rankings. I think the reason why this didn't work is largely because it felt like a little bit of a loser's play off the top. You're automatically sort of suggesting to people that you don't actually feel comfortable and confident that you're going to win, and you're already playing for second. I think it wreaked a little bit of desperation by both those camps and showed that Ms. Crombie had a pretty sizable lead and was eventually going to win. And so while they might have encouraged and some of those diehard supporters perhaps followed the rules that they suggested, I think overall most people thought, this is a bit of a last minute desperate play.
Let's go with Nate Erskine-Smith, federal member of parliament, certainly a candidate many would describe as exciting for young voters. But what were some of his major downfalls or the factors that just led him to not be competitive enough to win here?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Erskine-Smith, I think, built a very strong and solid campaign based on engaging young people on the issues that really resonate with them today. And I think that was a powerful message. And I think the results speak, sort of reflect that in the sense that he did come second. And so I do think he had the most, aside from Ms. Crombie's campaign, the most formidable campaign. I think some of the challenges with Mr. Erskine-Smith's campaign, however, were that he was a little bit too far to the left for some of the centrist voters. And I think where we sort of see Ms. Crombie emerging is as the centrist candidate, and it's bringing the party back to perhaps closer to those early Dalton McGuinty days, where it represents much more sort of centric and centrist liberal voters, which is, I think, generally where the province is, and which is why I think Ms. Crombie has a pretty good shot of becoming premier, if not the next election, the one after that. Mr. Erskine-Smith, I think, brought a lot of energy, brought a lot of good ideas, and I certainly hope, now he has to figure this out as he's still a sitting federal member, if I'm not mistaken, but he has to figure out how, whether he wants to continue to provide that support to Ms. Crombie, because engaging those young people and having him be part of that will be hugely important to the next election.
I want to follow up on something you just said there in terms of having a good shot at being the next premier. One of the biggest issues in today's political climate is housing, and housing advocates from across the province were rather critical of Ms. Crombie in terms of her record as mayor, blocking housing. Do you feel that that will haunt her in an election head to head against Doug Ford?
I think haunt is a bit of a strong term to use there. I certainly think that Ms. Crombie will have to come out with a more fulsome, more robust housing plan that reflects, I think, the broader province and takes on, head first the challenges that we're seeing here in Ontario. But no, I don't think this will haunt her campaign. I think the Conservatives and led by Doug Ford will try to make it sort of a nightmare, so to speak. But I think Ms. Crombie will offer a good revitalized vision of what the Liberal Party, liberal values in the province of Ontario after, I think, over the last number of years, particularly the last election, where perhaps those were a bit lost. And I think voters wondered what in fact it meant to be a liberal in Ontario. I think Ms. Crombie is going to bring that back in a very solid way. And it'll be interesting to see how she's able to contrast that and find her space between Merritt Stiles and the NDP and Doug Ford and the Conservative Party of Ontario.
You mentioned the NDP there and their leader. How much of a role do they play in terms of whether or not Bonnie Crombie becomes the next premier? And I ask that because the polling since the leadership transition from Andrea Horwath suggests that the NDP appear to have reached the ceiling. Do you share that view, or do you feel that that Miss Crombie will be able to further chip away at that NDP vote to make the Liberals more competitive with the Conservatives?
Well, I think a definition of success for Ms. Crombie the next time an election comes around will be to return to opposition. I think it's a tall ask to think that she's going to go take the party from 9 or 10 seats or whatever it is to majority government over the course of 3 years. I think that's a lot to ask. So I think setting expectations right will be really important for Ms. Crombie, and getting the party back into opposition will be first and foremost. And I think that's very possible. I think Merritt Stiles is a very compelling and powerful leader for the NDP. And certainly, I think an election campaign will allow her to sort of be exposed, so to speak, to voters, and they'll be able to get to know her a little better. And I think they're going to like what they see. But I think at the end of the day, generally speaking, the NDP is a bit far to the left for most Ontarians. And so the fight, as always, is really who can get that middle ground, who can get those middle voters, those centrist voters who for the last couple of elections have thought, well, Mr. Ford's been okay, and there's been no real alternative on the other side. Can Ms. Crombie, and I think in some recent polls that have just come out post her election, even though it's still early, suggest that she has been able to regain some of that ground. Can she continue to hold those and keep those centrist voters from drifting away to Ford, which I think is likely because he's got some big challenges these days, as we well know.
Elliot, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.